Welcome back. And I'm glad that we're kind of progressing in this way with understanding of the universe and relationships, almost kind of in a parallel, intertwined way. That way we can understand why aligning with the universe when we're trying to build a relationship with somebody is almost helping ourselves build a way of thinking of as an ethic, so that we're understanding what is it about emotions, what is it about being a human, and then what is it about trying to understand other people and nature, that if we understand all of them together, maybe separately and then together, that we can learn to get along and maybe not be hurtful to ourselves or to each other on the way. So I want to think about some of the ways that God talks about time in the Quran, that are very difficult to almost grasp. Like in the previous video, I talked about how sometimes God tells us that any way that you think about God, it's never really going to be um, even like close to all the different ways you can think about God. And now think about what that means actually. It's not to say that um, God is growing in a way, it's almost to say that the ideas about God continue to grow. And God doesn't want to say that any one way is actually all right or all wrong, because all our histories and all our pasts are going to be different. And the way people understand how to build on their old ideas to make new ones is going to be different. And they're allowed to do that because, well, God says they're allowed to. So who's to say that I'm a human and I'm going to say that I'm more right than God? We can't do that. So one of these examples is that God says that if somebody makes a mistake and decides that they're going to do that, they're going to say, you know what, Hiba, your idea of the way you think about God is wrong. So if I'm a little kid still and I'm just like, that's not nice, I'm trying my best. But let's pretend I'm an adult and I already think that, you know what, I've already studied this and I already know, and you're going to go to hell. So think about what just happened now. God could probably say, you know what, as an adult, you should know better than to talk to a child like that. So maybe I'm going to put your life into hell and make like really, really difficult for you so that you learn not to talk to kids like that and scare them about me. So think about what that is now, because when we think about the universe, we don't think of it as scary. We think of it as really cool. Like we look at the solar system and we look at how like all the planets move around the solar system in a certain way, and how each planet has a moon that kind of is really cool for the people. Like for example, on Earth only has one moon, and it's really cool for people on Earth to look at the moon and be like, wow. Sometimes it looks really close, sometimes it looks far, sometimes it has kind of different colors. Like sometimes it's a little bit reddish, sometimes it's this really cool blue, like a silvery blue. And then if you think about Mars, Mars has two moons, but nobody lives on Mars. So it's like, I wonder why that is. Like, why does Mars even have a moon? So all these curious questions about the universe, they're not meant to scare us, right? They're not anything other than to show that God has such creative ways of making us curious about the world and how to figure out how to use technology. That's it. So the reason that God tells us not to do things in the Quran, and why to be careful with some of the ways that we interact with each other, and why he'll like keep people in hell almost, is to say that if you treat people in a scary way, or try to force them to do something, then God is going to make them have ways of thinking that's going to make them live as though they're living in hell, right? So it's almost like that example I gave about the person who had an apartment building. And it's almost like the solution for problem solving his dilemma was really easy to anybody else. But for some reason, God wasn't allowing the angels to inspire him with how to create a solution, because he didn't seem like he even wanted to look for a solution. He just wanted to be lazy. So I was like, fine, let's see how laziness helps you. So this is kind of what we can try to understand about time, and how if God says, for example, if somebody does something that is actually more hurtful to the way that people think about the universe, then God's not going to forgive them. And he can say, even if other people try to forgive and ask for God to forgive that person for 70 years. So think about that. Now, God's not even saying that to any regular person. He's first saying that to the prophet. So he's saying to the prophet, if people are trying to hurt you for trying to defend your freedom of thinking, and you're trying to be helpful, like you're not trying to get in their way, they're getting in your way, and then you're trying to save yourself and defend yourself and leave, and they're still getting in your way, and they continue to try to create confusion for other people so they don't even know about the reason why you're maybe trying to defend yourself, and sometimes you have to fight, then then in that case, God says, don't even worry about them. Like, you can try to ask forgiveness, you can try to do whatever you want. The angels are not going to go and help them. Even if you do this for 70 years. So imagine you spend your entire life, like he's saying to the prophet, if you spend your entire life and then die and live another 70 years, God's not going to change their mind about them until they decide to change their behavior and improve. Then God's going to align, and then he's going to say, it's not even your problem anymore. Like, the angels will help. So when we say 70 years, it's almost to say, if you spend your entire life trying to change someone into a good person, whatever that ends up being, because who knows, but they themselves don't want to change their mind or change the way they're thinking, it's almost your waste of time. Like, why are you worrying about them? Worry about yourself. You have your whole life to worry about it, to make fun, like a fun way of living. And if somebody doesn't choose to think in a healthy way, that's for God to deal with them, and angels. Like, they can try to help inspire him, or maybe if he just has one moment of thinking, I wonder why that person does that, and then an angel might inspire them with a good idea, and there you go. So when we understand time as infinity, sometimes you can think of that. You can think of like a whole lifespan, which means if a person lives through a lifespan and then they die and then they wake up in the next life, they're probably not even going to remember what happened in their past life. So it's almost just to say, you're not going to be able to grasp that idea of time in your mind. So just let it go. And if something is mentioned as it's never going to happen, just assume that it's going to happen, but it's just not in a way that I'm going to be able to understand. So I'm not going to say that somebody's going to be good forever or bad forever. It just means that I shouldn't think about judging people, and just leave it at that. So if you think about what the number 40 is, I said that that there are two prophets that are mentioned that when they reach the age of 40, it's almost like God is using them as examples to say that you've reached the best age and time in your life where you can start to think about, what have I learned from my past that I want to continue doing, and what have I learned from my past that I don't want to continue doing, that I can start to kind of build ideas around. How do I make a new life now so that I can continue to make it better? Because after you reach the age of 40, you're starting to be an adult that can have influence, and at the same time your body is also going to start to weaken, so you're not going to have the same strength that you used to have when you were younger, like say 20 or younger, or a little bit older. So God says that in some narrations, remember how I talked about fortune telling and how sometimes people look for patterns, and then it's almost like they come to a point of almost superstition. Like, we talk about this in Halloween sometimes. Like, you shouldn't be superstitious where you think, if I see a black cat, that means I'm going to have bad luck for the rest of the day, right? Now, if you think about that, your mind's already going to be worried about it. So then you're going to start thinking, oh, like, I shouldn't do anything. I should probably just stay home. Is that life? That's not life, right? So that's why you should focus on the good things. And God says, if you're optimistic, which means if you think healthy and positive ideas about the world and the universe, your mind's going to look for those ideas, and you're going to want to be optimistic, meaning you're going to want to be positive, and you're going to want to live. So that's why, in a way, when God says, don't be superstitious, don't go to these people who try to fortune tell. And if you do that, God's not going to accept your prayer for 40 days. So you can think, well, I want to take that risk. Now, we don't know how God constructs time, because we just already talked about when you're sleeping, we don't know what your soul does. So imagine that 40 days actually ends up being the rest of your life. Now, anything you do, God's going to say, sorry, I can't help you. So you're already, the rest of your life almost looks like it's going to just be hell. And you don't even know how to fix it yet, because you decided to take a chance that maybe you shouldn't have taken. So in this way, we know that when God says these numbers, it's not to say that he's going to be doing something and we can calculate it and say, oh, well, you know what? If it's just 40 days, then fine, no big deal. It's almost to say, you don't know what that effect that might have on you and on other people. So don't assume that you have the knowledge of the universe and that your maybe really bad choice on purpose is actually going to be okay in the universe, because it creates other ideas. Like, remember we talked, it's all a network. And just because you decided that I'm going to support this person with buying their service and then reading the future, that they're going to not start thinking that, oh, I should hire more people and I should create a bigger business. And then they're going to start lying about people and their future. And then people are going to think that, no, but it might be true because this person's a good person and they believed it, so it must be true. Now think about all these people now that are believing lies that might become superstition, and now they're not living. They're just stuck in some kind of way of like, but this person said that I'm never gonna have a boyfriend, or I'm never gonna have love, and if I do, it was yesterday, and yesterday went out and I didn't meet anybody, and then you just start getting depressed, and it's like that's not the end. There's so many opportunities for you to meet somebody. It doesn't even have to be a boyfriend. It could just be like a really good friend, and it could be a boy, it could be a girl. So in this way, this is God saying, don't ever allow anybody to assume that they have all the knowledge that you can learn from. And especially if it's something that's going to be predicting something about you. Because God can change anything at any moment based on what your heart is really trying to learn and being sincere about. So, trying to understand. So, for example, there's one chapter that talks about how one day with God can be like 1,000 years of what we actually know to exist in the world. So think of 1,000 years. That's a millennium. So that's like thinking from 1900, before the Titanic was built, all the way up to 2000, before some of you might be born right now if you're 20. So think of all that time. Imagine that we don't know what God does in the universe during that time. And maybe because during that time there was a lot of war, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of people who maybe used to work with black magic. And all of that, God is saying, I'm using that amount of time to actually let people almost trial and error with technology and the way they think about the universe. And I'm going to forgive them. But all these people, they're almost stuck in a kind of like really difficult life. We won't call it hell, because then you'll think like, is hell on earth? Like, can we leave? It's not that. It's the way that you're thinking about something and problem solving with it almost that makes life really difficult to live, and almost makes us almost feel guilty. Like, we hurt people by accident, and how do we? So this is God's way of saying, just continue to try your best, try to improve, try to learn from the past, see what was happening that almost led people to make the choices that they did make, and then find ways in the future to maybe, well, I'm going to make that choice, but I'm not going to try to solve it in the same way they did. So if they solved it by creating a lot of teams on this side and a lot of teams on that side and saying, well, it's us and you, and we're going to have to try to solve a problem together, and then if we can't, we're just going to go to war. It's like, you just maybe made a bigger problem now, because the more people there are, the more difficult it is to reach some kind of solution. So instead of having me and you, it's like, why don't we all just try to collaborate together and see what happens? And if it's a lot of diverse ideas, maybe that's normal, because it's very difficult to have a lot of people agree on just one thing. So agreeing on diversity is almost the best idea. So let's go back to relationships, where let's pretend I took advice from somebody who said, you know what, you shouldn't get to know this person because our families think in very different ways. So that makes me sad, because I'm like, oh, man, I wish we didn't have to be different. And then you feel like, why do we have to be different? And then you almost want to cry, and you're just like, I really like this person. And then, oh well. And then, so now there's two of you that are sad. And you're just like, you just think about it for a little bit and you pause. And then you think, well, maybe I could learn to be like them and they can learn to be like me. But then both families are like, no, you're not allowed. So now, if you're old enough, you can start to think, what's compromise? So compromise is almost like a way of negotiating, but it's almost negotiating something within yourself. So you can say, okay, I am not going to be a friend with this person, but now I don't also want to be a friend with my family. Now think about that. It's almost like, if my family has the choice to tell me that I'm not allowed to choose who to love, then maybe that's God's way of saying, fine, you're, as the family, they're going to lose some of the love that they have in their life too. Almost to show that it's very hard to understand why hearts love what they love. Only God actually really knows. And He's the one that puts certain kinds of love in our heart that are healthy. And if we don't follow them because of something that looks like it's too diverse, then it's almost saying that we're not appreciating something that God already put in the world to be very different, so that we can learn how to be new with it and think in new ways. So now let's think of a couple that's not brand new. Let's think of a couple that's maybe been married or together for like 15 years. So that's a very long time. They might even have a lot of kids already. And all of a sudden, somebody at work decides, I really want to get to know this couple. And so they all become friends. So now there's three adults, like two of them are married or like in a relationship, and there's this third person from work that they kind of invite over, and they start to have friendships with, and coffee and tea. And then they start learning about the way each other live. And then one of these people decides, whoa, I don't think our relationship's good enough. And for some reason, all three of them stop being friends. And we don't know why. Maybe somebody judged somebody and said some of those mean things like, wow, what you're doing is wrong. So anyway, for whatever reason, they end up not being patient with each other and they end up losing their friendship. And then maybe they divorce if the couple were living together or married or whatever the situation was. But anyway, that family doesn't live in the same house anymore. And they all sort of have to kind of figure out where we're going to live, how we're going to move on. And that's normal because it happens. But if you didn't actually stop before that point and try to compromise and say, well, what is it that made us think that we weren't allowed to change our mind or allowed to compromise and say, well, let's be patient with ourselves and see why we're not able to find a way to resolve this. And sometimes it's good to ask for help from outside. Like there are people who are professionals who are called counselors or therapists, and their specialty in life is to be like those psychologists I talk about, which is they understand how people think and how the way they think can actually sometimes be difficult for them to live in the world because they need to almost update the way they think a little bit. And because we're always doing research and we're always learning new things about relationships and how the brain thinks and how environments can impact how we think, and especially stress, if we're doing a lot of things that are very difficult, remember, it limits creativity. So it almost makes life very, very difficult to be fun. So they can find ways to help you. Like, remember how to be fun. Like, take a break, allow yourself to maybe go on vacation and try to build that kind of relationship that's safe for you to be in again. Now, let's pretend that there's another couple outside of this one that has like three. There's one couple that one of them maybe stays at home and she maybe works from home, and the other one works outside of home and they don't have kids. Now, while she's working from home, she's kind of learning about different lifestyles and like, oh my goodness, I want to build some of these habits that are new. And then the one that she's kind of living with, or the person that she loves, decides, I don't want you to learn those habits. Those aren't healthy habits. So now it's like, well, how do you know? Like, I like them. Why don't, is it okay if we try to understand like why we don't feel safe with this habit? And it might not even be anything dangerous. Like, it might be something like, I want to understand the way these group of people think. And maybe that person just used to, maybe in the past, know somebody who used to think like that, but he just wasn't very kind. So it's not that the way he used to think about like prayer, for example, was bad. It's just that prayer didn't really help him in a way because he was just somebody who was still learning how to be kind with people. So it's almost like he has a strength, which is prayer, and he has this challenge that he has to try to build goals around, which is how to be kind. And because he didn't know how to do that yet when that person met him, he just assumes that he's just a bad person. And he thinks like prayer doesn't mean anything in the world. But he hasn't known him long enough to say that eventually that prayer is going to help him, but he just has to take his time with it because learning takes a long time. But he doesn't know that because they stopped talking to each other, and now he has this person that he loves who's like, I want to start praying. And he's like, no, it's gonna make you a mean person. And that's the way sometimes the brain works. It just draws really quick conclusions, and it doesn't sometimes look for ways to say, well, when is that not true? Like, I can probably look for people who pray who are kind. Like, how am I supposed to know that it's just that one person that I should build an idea on? And that kind of goes back to what Freud did. Like, he had a case study and he just kind of tried to make it something that can look like it applies to everybody. And it sometimes does, it sometimes doesn't. So it really just depends on how people are socialized and how people are almost parented, as it were. So sometimes, like in that scenario, that couple, they might decide that, you know what, if you're going to build that habit, kind of like that 13 on 30 movie, 13 going on 30 movie, sometimes they just decide, okay, we're just going to part ways. We're just not going to be able to live together anymore. And some people might say, yeah, that's a good idea because the way you two live, it's too different and you're never going to be able to get along. Other people might have said, I wish you would have stayed patient because I'm sure, like we know, if you're trying to align with the universe, eventually you're both going to be inspired, even if you don't even try to understand what the other person is doing, but at least you're not judging. Like if you say, okay, you can try that habit, but is it okay if I don't try it with you? That's safer because then you're like, okay, you don't have to compromise and I don't have to compromise. Like nobody has to. So it's safer because you don't have to feel like you have to give anything up. Sometimes you might have to say, well, I guess during the night, this person's going to kind of wake up and decide, I want to pray for a little bit. So it might wake me up in my sleep. So I have to almost compromise that. I might almost be disturbed in my sleep a little bit. So I'll have to maybe ask, okay, well, when you are waking up, do you mind just being a little bit quiet so that I'm not waking up with you? And they're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna try my best, but I don't want us to sleep in like separate bedrooms anymore, like because then it's gonna make maybe the love in our relationship die. So can we try to compromise? Can we try to negotiate how this new habit's going to kind of make changes in our life? So at least in this way, one person's allowed to start a new habit, the other person doesn't have to join in, but now they have to understand how this habit's actually going to maybe change a little bit of how they live their life. And sometimes one person might think, maybe I can change the time of day that I think about praying. Maybe the other person will think, maybe I'll find a way to wake up with you and I'll just do a different habit. So in this way, you can see how the love that they want to have for each other is more important than the choices that they make. And sometimes that's really hard, especially if you come from a family who, for them, drinking alcohol is normal, smoking cigarettes is normal, going to parties is normal, smoking cannabis is normal. And they go into these families where all of this is normal for them. But sometimes they think, because I am starting to maybe think that when I do some of these habits too much, it really gives me a headache, or it makes it very difficult for me to live my life. So I'm gonna maybe not do them very much anymore. And other people say, okay, well, when we go to parties, you can just have juice or you can have pop. You don't have to have what I have. And then they'll say, yeah, I know, but then I worry that, for example, your health might almost deteriorate or like worsen, because some of these habits, if you do them for a long time, they can actually start to impact your organs on the inside. So it's almost like, I know, and I almost wish that you would want to like kind of create healthy ideas about how you want to live your life. So anyway, I'm not going to force you. You can do it. You live your life and make your choices, but I'm going to quit. Right? So in that way, it's almost like you're helping each other build healthier habits, because there's like God, when he tells us that there's a healthy way to live in the world, and he'll say, but also don't make a mess of your life to the point that you're actually harming yourself. So it's to say, I put everything in the world for you, almost because I want you to understand how to make your own boundary with yourself outside of what anybody's telling you is right or wrong. So you'll see people sometimes, if you go to Canada's Wonderland, when I used to go when I was a kid, they'd have like at the entrance this really massive mountain. I don't know if it's a real mountain or if it's an artificial one, but it's really, really high. And they'd have people who'd like to do stunts. So sometimes when you watch movies, people who can do these really cool moves with their body. Some of them are helped, like there's computers and machines that help them move, and some of them are real, like people actually learn how to do this with their body, like acrobats. So anyway, when we used to go to this attraction park, people would actually stand on that mountain, and there's this really big pool at the bottom, and they'd love to jump off of it and dive in, and sometimes they do really cool flips in the air as they're landing. So for other people, they might think, is that a healthy habit? Like, what if they knock their head off off the mountain somewhere and then they die? That's the risk they're willing to take, and that's where God says, if you already have that kind of drive in you, that you just love that adrenaline rush and you love making adventurous risks, there are so many safe ways to do that. And for people who stand in front of people's way, who like to do that with their life already, it makes both their lives very difficult. Because let's imagine I'm a quiet person who likes to read and likes to just maybe take walks in the park. That's really safe for me, but it's because I'm just a quiet person. Imagine somebody who likes that kind of excitement in their life, right? We might be friends, but it's not fair for me to say, come read with me all the time. And it's not fair for that friend to say, come and do all these exciting things with me all the time. Because we already know about people's nervous system, which means the way their nerves and their body with their brain works is very, very, very specific to each individual person. So something that might make you nervous might make somebody else really, really excited. Like think about giving a presentation. Some people love that. They love standing in front of crowds and making jokes and sharing stories, where other people, they're like, there's no way ever in my life I'm going to ever want to do that or be brave enough to do that. And they might say that when they're young, and then they might learn the skills and then maybe change their mind. They might not do it with as much enthusiasm. They might be a little bit more quiet when they're giving their presentation. But it just shows that how the way our body works is actually the reason why we are very, very different. And it's very difficult to change somebody if they're not willing to kind of build the skills to almost modify the way their nervous system works. And so this is kind of why sometimes people will say, I'm introverted. Introverted means that their nervous system, or if you look at the skeleton, it has the spinal cord, and that spinal cord is basically what connects to the brain, and it has all these nerves, and these nerves connect all the way through the body, and they help us feel. So if I am going towards something that is hot and the nerves all along my arm don't work for some reason, I'm not going to know that if I touch that it burns. I'm not going to even feel the heat. It's almost like these nerves don't work anymore. So my brain's not even going to know to warn me. And I could just light my hand on fire and I won't even know. It won't hurt me. That's very dangerous, right? Because then it's going to reach the rest of my body and that's it. So that's why understanding how the body works is actually one of the ways that God says, if you understand the inside of the mechanics of what your body can do, you'll understand the universe. You'll understand God, because it's all the same. We have this balance in our body that's called a pH balance. Just the way the universe has a balance, where if things get too out of balance, we have storms. In our body, if that pH balance changes, we get sick. Like we'll get a fever, maybe we'll have a really bad stomachache, maybe we'll have diarrhea, maybe we'll vomit. All of these things are to show our body that there's something that's not right and the body's trying to fix it in a way. Sometimes it'll get an infection where like part of your body will just get swollen. Like I used to have that. It'll almost get more fatter a little bit, and it becomes really hard to move and it actually hurts. So these are ways to show that there's something not right in your body and you have to figure out what it is. Sometimes it's because of the place that you live in. Sometimes if it's too hot or if it's too cold and your body's not used to it, because it's like, well, my entire life I lived in a really, really hot climate and now you're putting me really cold. Like what is going on? And so it just takes time for your body to adapt, and then you adapt. Like maybe if situations are very, very damp outside, where it's like really snowy or really wet and I'm outside, my body's like, I'm used to hot. What is this? And it starts to like react. So it's just a way of understanding that God's telling you that if you do decide to move and travel, that's healthy. But you have to understand how your body works and how climates work, like different seasons work and different weather. That way you're not frustrated with your body and you're, again, trying to make the most of your life and try to live a happy life that you like. So back to that story. Let's pretend now that couple is trying their best. So they're going to actually give it a try. They're going to say, okay, we're going to build habits. We're going to compromise around some of what these habits do in our life that kind of change a little bit of how we live. And that's going to almost emphasize that, yeah, sometimes as we're growing, we build habits. Sometimes we forget about habits and we find out which ones were kind of really important, which ones maybe, well, it's okay. I mean, they're important, but we can maybe change them a little bit. And some of them we don't even realize that we forgot about. Now, if we go back to that original family that was originally a couple and they had a lot of kids, I wonder what would happen if they didn't judge. Or like sometimes you almost want to wonder, like, I wonder what happened. And you almost want to ask, but you're not sure if you should. For me, I used to think that way. I used to always be like, I'm really curious. I want to know. The best thing usually to do is just to watch entertainment. Just watch movies, watch books, read books. And they usually end up being stories about people who used to have these kind of difficult situations in life and they didn't know how to resolve them yet. So it's usually something new. And because there's nothing in the world to help these people, and maybe they don't have the professional support yet to help them through whatever that struggle was. So people like to write about it, and they like to make movies about it or create art about it. And in that way, their mind is helping them try to make sense of what happened and why am I sad about it? And how am I allowed to feel better? Even though I was sad, I'm able to kind of grow out of it and learn from it. And this is what God says with the prophet, is that one of the prophet's friends actually got married to a woman. And then after a little bit, they couldn't get along. And they didn't know why they couldn't get along. But anyway, they ended up having a divorce. And then the prophet, even though he was really close friends with that man, he kind of liked his wife, even though he divorced, like that man divorced her. So his name is Zayd, and he married Zainab. And they ended up divorcing. And the prophet was actually somebody who had adopted Zayd. He used to be somebody who was a slave. And the prophet just let him live with him. He's like, Slavery is very difficult to understand. It's almost like when you find somebody who looks like they're kind of free and just minding their own business, and then somebody decides, I'm really rich and I'm also very lazy, so I'm just gonna buy this person and I'm gonna make him do the work for me. And I might not even let him go if he asks me to go. This was a practice I used to do a long time. It's not very common anymore. And it's something that the whole world is trying to kind of not encourage to do because it's not healthy. It takes away from freedom of expression and all the human rights that God says we're all born with. So so when the prophet found out later that God sent a verse that says you shouldn't adopt people, um, and if you do, make sure that they keep their name so that you're almost allowing them to be a friend and they keep their lineage, they keep their history, and you're almost letting them into your family as a way to help them not get lost sometimes around the world back then by people just almost like abducting them and then saying, now you have to do this for me. And they're like, I have no way out. Like, I have no way to protect me yet. So, so because in this way, it's not like Zayd became the prophet's son. It was just like he became his friend in a way. So anyway, what happened was after Zayd divorced Zainab, a little bit of time passed, and then the prophet found that he kind of liked Zainab, and he's like, I don't know. And this is a problem that happens all the time. It's usually when like two friends are best friends, and then one friend has a boyfriend, and then they split up, and then you can actually watch this, I think, in Mean Girls. And then after that, the girl that had the breakup, she'll say, "You're not allowed to date that boy." And it's almost not fair. It's like, but you're not either. And this is what happens with society. Rules change, what people understand about how to be friends change, and we try to understand why these emotions exist. Like, why would I want you guys to be friends? And it becomes like, well, if I want to be this boy's friend, does that mean I can't be your friend? Like, these two girls can't be friends anymore because now this boy's getting in the way, or the other way around, like it's two boys and a girl. All these ideas that come up as we get older and like into adolescent years and young adult years become real problems because our hearts are they have so many emotions, and our brain sometimes has no idea how to understand them because sometimes there's not enough knowledge in the world to help us understand them yet. And sometimes we don't even know how to learn. Like, what questions do I ask to help me understand what my emotions are and how to solve them? So anyway, God sent down a verse and he said, you are allowed to marry Zainab. And this is so that people after you are encouraged not to create a problem about this and to find a way to resolve it, actually. Because if two people are divorced, it means there's a problem that they can't fix together, and it's actually healthier for them to not live together and try to fix it because they're just not going to be happy. And God's allowing that to be normal. He's saying that's diversity. You can try, and if it doesn't work, fine, it's okay, you're allowed to change your mind. And I think that's basically something that we've kind of forgotten about in conservative traditions or traditional families, where sometimes people don't even let people divorce. Like it's like if the prophet himself was sometimes contemplating with his own wives, like, they gave me such a hard time. Like, I left and I left and I left and I left and I stayed away for so long that people were wondering, like, they would go to the wives of the prophet, like, how could you make the prophet so angry that he left and he's thinking about divorcing you? And it also it shows how God allows women to be angry. Like, sometimes they're just angry and the prophet's like, all right, I'm going to be angry too. And that's all part of a normal way of living. And it's not to say that, we always have to pretend we're this family that never has a fight or never has problems, that maybe we need to take time apart and try to figure out, like, how big is this problem and how is it going to actually impact the way we live, and what can we do to change, and what do we not want to change, and maybe we have to, like, decide to live apart, and that's okay. So all of these things are, sometimes people assume that if you haven't had a relationship, it's very difficult for you to talk or give advice about one. And I agree, because if you haven't really tried something, you won't really know how difficult it is. But from my understanding, because I'm studying a tradition, and I still like to study traditions that tell us about how God gives us these stories so that we can learn before we try something what to look out for. So some people will say, before you get married, it's important to actually learn together why divorce is a thing. So we can even talk about something and say, we want to be optimistic about our relationship in the future, but when are we going to be allowed to divorce and not feel bad about it? And what if we have kids? So in that way, it's almost like it's not going to be something that happens in the middle of the relationship where we start to threaten each other and be like, if you don't do this, I'm going to divorce you. And then it just becomes a hurtful way of just creating ultimatums, which is not a nice way to build a loving relationship. An ultimatum is, if you don't do this, then this. And it usually ends up being a really mean consequence. Like, and it just gets like, you might as well just divorce. Like, you're not going to have a healthy relationship if you just keep threatening each other like that. So learning about all these healthy emotions is a good way to kind of build your life from a young age, because you're already learning